Morning. I hope everybody is well. It's good to see everybody. As always, I appreciate your time and energies on our behalf. I always appreciate our conversations. We'll get started with today's meeting. Kate, if we'll go through roll call.
Yes, give me 2 seconds. I'm trying to get my screen shared here. Okay. Apologies. Yes, this is it. Can you all see my screen?
We can, yes.
All right, excellent. Let me get it. Oops. Oh, wrong one. Let's present it so you can actually see it, maybe.
Perfect.
Awesome. All right. Sheriff Adams.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Tom Albin. Dr. Anderson.
Here.
I think I saw you. Dr. Arlato, you are here, of course. Karen Bailey, I saw you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Coach Bell.
Good morning.
Good morning. Megan Berger. No, Megan, okay. And Claire, I see you this morning. Good morning. Do we have Dr. Coleman on? Okay, Delegate Ebersol. Director Engel. And do we have Pamela Gaddy on the line? Captain Herring. Dr. Hoover.
Present.
I saw you. Good morning. Chief Kiefer, I saw you this morning as well.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Senator Klossemeyer. Nope, I don't see you. Laurel Moody, I saw you this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Lee Oppenheim. Let's see, Lee. Secretary Padilla.
Good morning.
Good morning. Manfred will not be in today. Detective Smith.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nick Shockney.
Good morning.
Good morning. Scott Tippin. Andrew Trest.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning. And I see Lee just joined us or is in the process of joining us. Did I miss one?
I'm here.
Great. Good morning, Lee.
Sorry, I was in the waiting room.
So we have 14 voting members present and we do have a quorum.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Kate. The agenda went out. We're going to continue our conversations. Does anybody have any suggested changes or edits to today's agenda? Not hearing anybody. Could I have a motion to approve today's agenda?
This is Chief Kiefer. I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Thank you, Chief. In a second.
This is Secretary Padilla. I second that motion.
Thank you, Secretary Padilla, for the second. Any discussion regarding the agenda? Not hearing anybody. All those that approve, just say aye or raise your hand. And
Aye.
Aye.
any opposed?
Aye.
No opposed. So the meeting agenda is approved as printed and sent to you, and we'll continue to move forward. Thank you for that. Kate, we want to continue our conversation around identifying recommendations.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So as you all know, you've been working very hard to identify gaps and opportunities in school safety and make recommendations on how to address those gaps. We got through about half of the observations last time. we'll hopefully get through the rest today. There were a few that we pulled out, and I'll talk through them shortly. So here we are, we're in recommendations. We're still discussing the recommendations that you all are hopefully going to be making to address some of the gaps and needs that we have in school safety in the state. So there are a few of the observations from the last time given the conversation that we feel either MCSS, the team at MEMA, the GSOM team at MEMA, or MSDE can coordinate together to try to solve some of those immediate needs. So I'm going to run through these shortly. We have about 6 of them. So the first one is a need for better clarification, support, and funding to implement standardized school facility vulnerability safety assessments that incorporate state and federal guidance as best practices. MCSS feels that that is something we can already accomplish, or at least work toward accomplishing directly without it having to get to the subcabinet for approval. That's something we'll begin working on in 2022. And please stop me, raise your hand. Dawn's going to be monitoring because I can't look in 3 places. So if you have your hand up or you want to speak or you have something in chat, we'll keep an eye out. The second is need a consistent emergency planning and preparedness for all schools, which includes private, public, non-public, and special ed education schools to ensure that every student is safe. So this is something MSDE puts out the emergency planning guidelines. We are in constant communication with them. We actually now have monthly meetings with MSDE, with the team that actually does that emergency planning guideline. So along with the GSOM team, and for those of you that don't know, the GSOM team is the federal grant through the Department of Education, that funds emergency management planning at the state level. And so that is a grant that got awarded to MSDE and is now being initiated by the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. So that team over there is working on that. So between the 3 of the 2 departments and our agency, we think we can accomplish that as well. Any questions on that? Okay. So
Kate, it's Lee. I do have
Sure.
a question. So is the format of the guidelines that you're working on changing? Because the guidelines up until now have always been specific to the public schools. And so, and I'm wondering if there's room for people from the different entities, the non-public special ed schools and the private schools, to be part of a team that works on this together.
So the Department of Ed is going to be putting together the guidelines are already developed. Every time that they do a revision, they typically gather some individuals to discuss and have conversations about what's included in those revisions. This is going to be slightly separate from that. So in addition to them addressing the needs at the public school level, we are going to be working with our team as well as the GSOM team and MSDE to develop how do we implement that if we're not a public school guidance, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Lee, you're still on mute.
Yeah, I got it. It does.
Okay.
Just if there's room for people from outside to work on that,
Yep.
Let us know, because we're happy to help.
Absolutely. Observation C, similar small private and non-public schools don't have resources available to address preparedness efforts, including facility safety assessments, comprehensive all hazard emergency plan development, training, and exercise. So again, this is going to be tied to that one earlier. So we will be working to support not just public, but private and non-public special education facilities with being able to do comprehensive emergency planning through the GSOM grant. Okay. Again, observation D, small private and non-public schools need more assistance in collaborating with local responders and identifying family notification or reunification centers within their communities. So we're going to assist getting the private and non-public schools that need connections to their local emergency management offices or first responders. Our team will help make those connections so that you all can have, so that the private and non-public schools can have those connections in their communities. Okay. And that's an easy phone call right to the regional team in their area for where they're assigned. Observation E was need for online and in-person training resources for different positions throughout the school safety community. Administrators, security staff, mental health, bus drivers, other school staff needing different levels of school safety training. So we're going to take that initiative on too also in 2022. So our team is already looking at expanding some of our existing training, figuring out ways to train individuals who we are not mandated to train, but sort of expand the existing training that we have and incorporate some of the others, as well as tie into some of the work that the GSIM team is doing. So we'll be doing that in 2022. It's already 2022. Observation F, include various publicly available school safety data in one location. So I think this one, Claire, this was one of your great ideas, and we have started to have that conversation of how we sort of integrate or bring in all of those existing data sources and put them in one easy to find location on our website. So the team is already starting conversations on how to make that happen. All right, so now we're going to go through the observations that we need recommendations for. The first about 7 observations all have a recommendation listed. The last few do not, so we'll focus mainly on the last, but I do want to run through all of these and make sure that these recommendations, given our last conversation, are what you all were thinking given the observation. So observation 1, it is unclear if legislation actions and efforts are making improvements in school safety. And the recommendation for this was to conduct a comprehensive statewide school safety survey or modify an existing one of public, private, and non-public school students, educators, staff, and parents throughout the state, and setting baselines and measuring results over time. Does that recommendation sound like what you all discussed in the last meeting?
Sharon has a hand up.
Oh, hi, Sharon.
Hi, thanks. I just would recommend that whatever is created or conducted be done in alignment with the school climate surveys that are done, because a lot of the pieces of those school climate surveys ask about safety, both emotional safety, physical safety.
So the questions that are asked as a part of the school climate survey that's done pursuant to ESSA are not, it is not possible for MCSS to get access to the individual questions. So they are able to obtain the results that come in, and they can get aggregate results from MSDE related to those surveys, but they cannot get the actual questions in order to determine what else might need to be asked, if that makes sense.
Like, you can't find out what the questions are?
No, they won't release them.
Okay.
But we will include that as part of the recommendation. Any other comments on this one? All right. So observation 2, The impact of COVID on students and staff is evident. We need more student and staff supports to identify behaviors of concern, de-escalate situations, and provide resources to re-engage and strengthen the school community, students, parents, and staff relationships. So the recommendation here was to develop or expand informational practices and training to educate students on concerning behaviors of their peers. Any concerns, questions about this recommendation? Okay.
Is there a parallel recommendation? Okay, for staff? Just because the observation was about students and staff, and that recommendation seemed to just be about students, but perhaps that's what the next one is.
Excellent point. And hold on one sec, let me look. Yeah, so I think apologies, we did leave that out for the educators and staff. So we will add that in as, or just expand on 2.1 so that they're separate.
And Karen has her hand up.
Thanks. Yes, I just want to emphasize that whatever training we do for students, we need to engage on their level and have it be in whatever venue or platform or whatever that they use to communicate. Not a PowerPoint or having everyone on a Zoom call and have them talk at them. I think for that piece, it would probably be really good to get some of your, your student groups involved in brainstorming on how training or how these conversations are best received by the students.
Excellent suggestion. And Claire, I do see your hand.
Just to add on to that, I think the student focus group could be incorporated really well here. I think we could provide a lot of recommendations in terms of what students want to see in these presentations, what platforms we want to see utilized, and how this information could be presented to us. So I think incorporate into this recommendation, you can include a part about the student focus group, because I'm sure students would be more than willing to give their perspectives and opinions on what are best suited to them.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions on this recommendation? Okay. And so a second recommendation on this observation is to continue efforts that communicate the impact of trauma and the need for trauma-informed care. Any modifications, suggested improvements?
No hands raised.
Okay, thanks. And the third was to expand mental and behavioral health supports, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, and existing student health curriculum. Any comments, improvements?
I'm just not clear on what this means. So expanding supports in the curriculum, are they two separate recommendations? Like expanding, is it just expanding content in the student health curriculum on the topics of substance use and suicide ideation, or is this actually expanding supports and expanding the curriculum?
No, for this one, it is expanding the curriculum. It is strictly focused on the curriculum itself.
Okay.
Was this
so then, okay. So then to me, the word supports is just a little confusing here. I would think it might be content, but.
Right, because you mean educating about the availability of mental and behavioral health support. So, and I guess just a FYI, because that is required in existing student health curriculum, but it's done to differing degrees depending on the school system. So there might be a need to assess what's being done, and then to ensure that it's being done in a standard and bring everybody to the same level across all 24 systems in order to ensure that everyone's getting the same level of information about those supports.
Any comments
So,
on?
so shouldn't that be also part of the recommendation to make sure it's standardized across the state?
Any comments on that?
I do. So, and Dawn, correct me if I'm wrong, but curriculum or the health curriculum and anything curriculum based has to come directly through MSDE and through the legislature. If we would want, you know, if we're going to make a change like this, does that have to come through the legislature and then through MSDE, or can we just go directly to MSDE in order to adjust it?
So I would need to take a look at what the existing regulations are with respect to that portion of the curriculum. I know that it's required, but to the extent to which it is spelled out what must be in it and the length of it, I don't know that off the top of my head. So that's something I can look into and then share back with everyone. But that, you know, that if there was a need to update the regulation, or make any changes in order to standardize it, that would be a subsequent discussion that would have to happen and MSDE would have to handle because it's within their regulatory authority.
Okay, and I'm just thinking of timing because the changes, we made changes to the health curriculum, I believe 2 years ago. And I think they're just now implemented this year. And I don't know if that was a delay because of COVID and the pandemic, or if that's just how the, you know, how the legislation was worded. So, you know, if I'm just throwing it out there that if there's something that we want, I guess, implicated or implemented more quickly, we might want to kind of tweak the recommendation a little bit on specifically noting that it has to be in the health curriculum.
Yep, I'll check that. And it's entirely possible if there was that kind of a delay in the implementation of the change that happened during I can't remember whether it was the 2019 or the 2020. It's all a big blur. There's pre-COVID life and post-COVID life. And then see if regulations were in fact ever adopted, because they may not have been if there was a substantial lag time. So.
All right, and then once we have that, we can adjust the recommendation to include changes to the regulation if necessary.
And Secretary Padilla has her hand up.
Yes. Secretary Padilla?
Yes, I'm sorry. It took me a little while to unmute myself. Just a recommendation that I know the Lieutenant Governor is sharing the Mental and Behavioral Health Commission, where some of this has also come up. So I would recommend that you would compare what is being done by that commission so we can align and sync the efforts, and not necessarily, I'm assuming that some legislation might come out of the health commission that the Lieutenant Governor is spearheading. So we do want to align those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right. So recommendation 3 or observation 3 was needing mechanisms to fill gaps in human resources, including educators, crisis intervention support, security, mental health, social workers, basically staffing shortages across the board. So the first recommendation was to expand out-of-state recruitments. Is there anything, so that was part of the conversation you had in November. Is there something specific regarding expanding out-of-state recruitments that could be that we could better flush this recommendation out.
I'm looking for hands. I'm very diligently looking for hands. Dr. Hoover.
And so I assume that this is just a workforce recommendation. And I don't know if this is the only one you have, but I mean, there's a number of recommendations that you could put here, right? Like enhancing the workforce pipeline by partnering with institutions of higher education, reaching down to even to high school. I mean, and those are not immediate fixes, but those are workforce pipeline recommendations. There's also licensing, loosening of licensing or regulations and cross-state loosening of, at least in the mental health field, better using telehealth. So there's a number of recommendations I think that could be added here to address what this observation is with respect to workforce. I don't know if that's getting at what you're looking for, but I think expanding out-of-state recruitments would be one of many.
Yeah, and there were a few that came up last month. So expanding out of state, financial incentives, but I will add the others. So maybe what we could do is create a recommendation that is overarching workforce and then sub bullets of all of the different areas to focus on. Okay, we can do that. Any other suggestions besides those that Dr. Hoover came up with? Licensing, financial incentives, out-of-state recruitment.
I think there's also looking at the processes that we have to go through to staff the educators and making sure that there's an efficient way to do it. Like there's a 21-day delay when you have to go back and interview all the previous employments before you can bring somebody into school right now. There's also the issue that's hitting with CGIS, where even though we're all required to do the fingerprinting, CGIS has decided to stop reporting to schools that aren't government agencies. So there's a lot of things in the background that MSDE is currently working on that needs to be part of this to make it more fluid.
Anyone else?
I don't see any hands.
Nope.
Okay. Observation 4 was the collection of school safety and other data collected and reported by the state, including things like arrest data and bullying data, needs more consistency across the school systems to limit inaccuracies and reduce data collection and reporting requirements of local schools and school systems. So that was the observation. So the recommendation was to conduct an assessment of school collected data to determine how best to consolidate and report information that better informs school safety initiatives and actions. Any comments on this? Any recommended changes or expansion? Ways to better refine it? Yes, Coach, I see.
Sorry, I couldn't find my hand button. When we're talking about this collection of school safety data, are we, I don't know how you would do this, are we taking into account the location of the school?
I'm sorry, repeat your question. I didn't understand your question.
When we're talking about the collection of school safety data, we're talking about what happens at the school, but we're also taking into account where the school is located and what's going on in that community. Because
Oh.
like some of that stuff is being brought into the school, but it has nothing to do with the school.
So you're talking about community reporting data. Are we also collecting that? Is that the question?
Yeah, somehow I just making sure, because I know, like, there's a lot of issues I see going on sometimes, especially with our school, but it has nothing to do with our school. They actually had to do with what's going out in the community, and it's getting brought to our school, but then it counts against our school.
So, yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I understand the phrase counts against the school, right? But the school is in fact part of the community, and in terms of whether the Center for School Safety or MSDE could gather data related to crime in the area where the school is located, they're able to get aggregate information about that, but not have the authority under their purpose for being to collect community crime data, right? So you could take a look and compare and do a table that shows what's going on in the community with aggregate data, and also, what's being brought in the schools. But there is a very distinct and important analysis to be done with respect to any criminal conduct or school safety issues, things that relate to the K-12 population as a whole.
So would Secretary Padilla?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm a little confused on the effort to reduce data collection. Where do we want to go with that? Could someone
I don't think
elaborate on that?
Yeah, I don't think the board wanted to reduce the data collected. I think they wanted to consolidate. So right now there are multiple data points being collected by multiple agencies and departments from different folks within especially the public school system, right? So there's all of these different reporting requirements. A good example is the arrest data report is law enforcement data being collected by the school system and reported by the school system up to MSDE. MCSS collects use of force data from both the school system and the law enforcement agency. So the recommendation in the last meeting, or the observation in the last meeting, is there's all of this data. Is there a way to consolidate all of this data collection into one report? Or if that's not the case, is there a better way that the collection can be done? I think that's where what the board was getting at last meeting. Unless I'm misunderstanding the conversation last month. So please, anybody correct me.
So do we want to change then the observation and not say reduce? Because it's consolidation is in the recommendation, but the observation makes reference to reduce data collection.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Arlotto, I think I see your hand.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to reiterate, we've talked about this before, particularly as it as it relates directly to arrest data. That's something that we as a school systems, each one of the 24 of us must submit to the state each and every year. But we don't actually, as all know, we're not arresting anybody. And so we have to rely on that information coming from our local law enforcement. And so having those conversations to make sure that that is done consistently across the school systems and involving law enforcement, that conversation, I think it will continue to be very important.
Thank you. Okay, and this goes right into your comment, Dr. Arlotto. So arrest data in schools should be, so the recommendation that came through after the meeting was that arrest data in schools should be reported by law enforcement and not school systems to ensure consistency and accuracy of law enforcement data. Thoughts on this recommendation? And again, these are just recommendations to be made to the school safety subcabinet. It doesn't mean that things will change. Is this a valid recommendation? Would it be a useful modification in the current process?
Looking for hands. Sheriff Adams.
I just quickly, my only concern with that would be, so there are, as Dr. Arlotto just said, there are 24 school systems. There are a lot more police agencies involved. So if you're wanting this data to only come in through law enforcement, I mean, I know we have a lot of reporting requirements for a lot of different data that's getting more complicated every day, that we have charts for when it's due and what has to go in. And with a lot of that, there are unfortunately a lot of law enforcement agencies that aren't complying with that. So I don't know what the, you know, what are the teeth in that if there isn't compliance to getting that data in. And I agree with what it says in the beginning, that we need it to be apples to apples across the board, because we run into that with other data that law enforcement has to turn in, that it, as Coach Bell kind of referred to earlier, referenced the schools getting penalized for things. Sometimes it makes law enforcement agencies look bad when they're actually reporting and other people are not. And it looks like, oh, wow, you guys have all this crime going on in your area. No, we're just reporting and other people are not. So I agree. This is a very important, and I don't know what the exact answer is. I just caution that when it's only coming through law enforcement. And I get it that there's the side. I mean, this kind of comes down to the relationships between the schools and the police, right? And the good, when those are strong, I think the state is easy to be handled collectively or through the schools as the police report to them and have committees already set up for such. And the ones that it is not strong, it's going to struggle either way. So that's just my 2 cents. I didn't solve anything there, but just my 2 cents.
Dr. Arlotto.
Thank you. I think Sheriff Adams brings up some very good points. There are, as diverse as the 24 school districts are, there are many law enforcement agencies that are engaged with our students throughout the day and in the evenings and on weekends. And so how to corral all of that data, I don't know how to make that work, but I do know that, for example, in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, and we have the highest arrest numbers in the state and have for the last couple of years. And we try and work and we work very closely with our local police department. But sometimes the data is not always accurate because of so much of the good work that law enforcement does post-arrest in diversion programs, where a student may get initially arrested and then go into a diversion program. That information may or may not be shared with local school system, and therefore we're unable to alter our own data. So I don't know, like Sheriff Adams, that I have a suggestion on how to do that better, but I know that there are some numbers that are falling through the cracks, so that I'm not sure that we have a completely accurate look at this across all 24 systems.
And Dr. Arlotto, you raised a great point, and that was something that was dealt with and discussed, and we did share an advice memo on that back in 2017, because you're 100% correct. It was not apples to apples. Some school systems were only reporting custodial arrests. They were not doing referrals to TGJS. They were not doing criminal citations. And so then certain numbers looked really low and other jurisdictions were reporting the whole variety of things. And the answer was that if a student is being subjected to the process of the court under the criminal law articles, then that should be reported. And it does not matter whether it's a referral, whether it's a custodial arrest, or whether it's a criminal citation. So to the extent that that needs to be a reminder given, then that's something that's definitely something that can be done. And we've got one more hand up. Mr. Smith?
Yes, ma'am. I have one thing on this. I know with us, I know we're unique because we have our own, our school system has its own police department. So our data is collected by our law enforcement officers, but also here in the city, we have so many other jurisdictions. When we're talking about BPD is probably the largest police department in the state. So anytime a student is arrested here in the city, whether it's by BPD, MTA, or whoever, we get information from them directly to us to tell us that a student has been arrested, whether they were leaving school on the weekends, wherever they were. That one of our students were arrested. So that data is then collected by us. So anytime I know one of our corporals who handle all of our data every year when MSDE is requesting the data and it comes down from our CEO's office, chief of schools, or from our chief, you already have a database where we get that data directly to MSDA. So I know with us, I know I can say again, we're unique because we have our own police department with our school system, but we also get our data directly from the other agencies here in the city so that our data is kept up to date. So when it is required from MSDE, we can give it right to them right away.
So given the discussion, it sounds like this recommendation may not fit the need if it's law enforcement only reporting the arrest data. So what could be a solution? Let's specifically talk about the arrest data. What are some strategies or what's a recommendation to fix the apples to apples or not apples to apples issue of arrest data reporting in the state?
Chief Kuiper?
Well, I mean, we're talking about arrest data, so I agree with the sheriff and I agree with Mr. Smith there that it's going to be tough on all of us in law enforcement, but the school boards aren't going to have the actual arrest data unless we report it to them. So, they could know if a student was removed from the school and charged because they're there and see that, but citations, paper arrests where it's just done officially on a referral, they may not know that information. There's just no other way to capture the data than to require law enforcement to do that. And that recommendation would have to be very clear and specific as to what that is. And Dawn, you brought that up already. We're in the same boat. We report everything and it looks like our numbers are much higher than everybody else, a lot of other places in the state. That's going to require, somebody to hold all of law enforcement accountable to that. But I don't know any other way to capture that data than to require law enforcement to do that. And although it's going to make it cumbersome on us because of all the reporting requirements we've got for everything else we do, is one more thing. I don't know how else you capture that data and do it in a way that's consistent. And like any other data you capture, it's never going to be perfect. We just need to get a better picture than where we are. And that's going to be something a little harder to do, but having someone else do it's just not going to happen. It's got to come from us.
And to clarify, there are two separate issues, right? Because you have the student arrest data collection currently that MSDE has, and that is for school-based arrests, right? And there's notifications and things that have to be done already between law enforcement and the school system when that occurs. Then there's the separate issue of reportable offenses, which may be things that are occurring out in the community during non-school hours, but notification again has to go from law enforcement to the school systems under that statute. And I think there are similar issues from what I hear, and to the chief's point, thank you, because Washington County is the one who brought this up back in 2017 with respect to what constitutes an arrest, and helped us to work through that. But that there might be a greater need for a holistic approach with respect to both the school-based arrest issue and the reportable offense issue and the data collected from both. Does that sound accurate? Okay.
And then Andrew, what role, if any, could or does DJS play?
Sorry, I'm actually having some connection issues. I'm not at my normal office location. Could you sort of rehash the question for me? I apologize.
Sure. So we're going back we're going back and forth on a conversation of right now. The regulation requires that school systems report to MSDE arrest data of individuals in their schools. There's a recommendation that that arrest data is actually or should be collected from law enforcement agencies. And my question for you for DJS is there a gap that you feel there? Is there a way for your reporting to alleviate some of the concerns about the multiple law enforcement agencies having to report if all the data is getting to you eventually?
Well, I know, I'm not a complete data collection expert, but I do know as far as like some of the school arrest data, what we collect, it doesn't necessarily distinguish all the time through if it's coming in through an SRO or, if say there's an incident at school and then a parent then goes to DJS to do a formal intake complaint, which is, the same difference as arrest statistically for us. We don't have any designating factors that say, oh yes, this was an SRO, this was from school. So there are gaps there. I believe there's, ever since we became part of the longitudinal data collection advisory board, I think they've been working through that a little bit, but I still believe there are gaps there. Does that answer the question? I'm sorry if there.
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I'm nodding along since I'm counsel for that body too. Sheriff Adams, did you have your hand up again?
Yes, just really quickly, just an idea. I know there's Clery Act reporting requirements through colleges that also blend through all police agencies. So, I mean, that could be a format that could be looked at to see if that'll work. So we have all the colleges that have to contact us and we have to give them all data of any crimes or anything that occurred on their campuses or any places that they use. So we get that data to them and that all flows through the colleges. But it's kind of on them to make sure they get that data. So, I mean, so that any way you look at it, it will fail if people aren't doing their jobs, right? And that's kind of what we're saying. But I think I'm just looking at the totality of the amount of people that are required to report. So if it's only 24, that's a smaller number that can be accountable, that yes, they would have to reach out to the law enforcement agencies in their area or anybody that they may have interaction with to make sure they have the data. But if you go the other route and it's all coming from law enforcement, that's going to be a greater number of people that you're looking to be responsible to have to get the data in. So just another thought, the Clery Act seems to work as far as I know, as far as them getting their reports in.
Secretary Padilla?
Thank you. I think this recommendation, this discussion is so important that we get right. And one, I was thinking, could we recommend that there is training to law enforcement across the state on what is reported? I'm sure there's legislation, regulations on what is reported, what is not. but perhaps it's the time for that to be revisited and make sure that it's consistent across the state. Then I do want to see some equity built in the reporting process, because I'm hearing your Washington, your Baltimore City schools, your Anne Arundel schools where there's a lot of diversity. I want to make sure that we take that into consideration, that all students are, and all acts are reported the same way with an equity lens. And I was wondering if the recommendations should be for a group or somewhat of a study to do a deeper dive on how the process should be. Thank you.
Mr. Smith, do you still have your hand up?
No, ma'am, I don't.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so what I'm hearing from Secretary Padilla is, instead of a blanket recommendation that the arrest data specifically should be reported one way or the other, that we potentially put together some sort of work group, diverse work group, where we can look at this, pull in law enforcement, pull in school systems, pull in MSDE, pull in the center, and have a conversation about how better to do this arrest data collection. Is that a reasonable modification to this recommendation? Seeing nods. Okay.
I think that summarized it really well.
All right. Any other comments on observation 4? Observation 5, a need to sustain funding to implement comprehensive school safety programs that includes assessment, planning, training, exercise, and evaluation. Consider representation of different systems, sizes, campus sites, experiences, and types of schools. The recommendation was to provide consistent funding for schools, private, non-public special education, and public to conduct regular facility safety assessments. So as you recall, in 2018, there was funding for public schools to conduct school safety assessments. That funding was 1 year, it was $2.5 million, and it was only for the first year to conduct those assessments. But we all know that assessments should be conducted regularly. So the recommendation here is to actually include additional funding, which that would be legislative action. Are there comments about this? Is there a specific dollar amount that you would like to include? Again, these would be recommendations. It's not a, it's not an absolute that it's going to happen, but if the board puts forth a recommendation to include funding for assessments, if there's not changes to legislation, there may be additional funding or grants through MSDE or other programs. We might be able to find federal funding, which we're always looking for, to be able to implement facility assessments. So any comments on this? Any input? Karen?
I just have a thought, and I'm gonna need Dawn on this one also. So with the Build to Learn Act that was passed, and I'm gonna punt over to Dr. Arlotto also. The school systems also, like, we have to do, someone's going to come in and do a facility assessment, correct, of the buildings, and then that's going to be the basis for whatever our capital improvement projects and our money is going to be going forward. So is there any way to tie a facility safety assessment into that, and kind of get some economies of scale, rather than, let's assess, whatever, and then let's assess whatever, and mesh the two together?
I'll say, sorry, Dawn, Karen, I think it's a worthy suggestion to explore. My initial reaction though is those groups that we anyway, or my time doing this and having those groups do facilities assessments, they typically don't have the expertise in safety and security of the buildings. They may in recent years, since we had our last study done here in Anne Arundel County, for example, because of all that's happening around the country, they may very well be adding those folks to their teams. We can certainly look into that, but it's a worthy suggestion to see if there is some economies of scale and look for those companies that do, those firms that do have some expertise in this area. The ones that I've encountered do not yet at this time, or haven't since we've last engaged them. Dawn, I'm sorry, I cut you off, I think.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that's a procurement issue and an issue for each system into figuring out how they want to best manage that. But that's, of course, relates to the public schools. And with respect to the private or non-public special education schools, everything is different because you're not subjected to the same statutes, you're not subjected to the same regulations. So it becomes kind of challenging because those are things you can choose to do. Those are things you may want to do for whatever reason, but unless you're then subsequently subjected to all the same things that the public schools are subjected to, the funding is not the same because the requirements are different. Chief Kuiper?
I was just going to say, we've done all the security assessments. I have staff here. I have a captain who's got a PhD in this field, and I've got other staff that are crime prevention through environmental design experts that come in. But we look at the facilities. We also look at policy. We look at the procedures. We do a really robust review of everything that has to do with the school. And we've done the private schools here in Hagerstown as well. Upon their request, but I'm unique, and I may be unique in the fact that I got staff here that have some expertise in this field, and it didn't cost anything for any of the schools for us to do that, or for the private schools. But I know that's not an answer what you're talking about here, but trying to find those companies that'll do this. If you can't find that, then again, take advantage of what we do have, and a lot of agencies have those expertise in crime prevention through environmental design, which could do the facility structures part. You just need to find that staff that can do the actual assessment of threats and the vulnerability side of it, which I'm fortunate that I have that here. But there are those people out there. What that costs, I can't give you any advice on that. But that's just where I'm at here. I just wanted to bring that up to the group.
Lee?
And I think the issue, at least for the non-public special education schools, but I think also the private schools, is the funding issue. And if there was available funding to get the assessments done, I think everybody would do it. But when you're asked to do it without the funding, the unfunded mandate behind it, it becomes an issue, especially with the budgeting issues that are going on with all the schools right now. So I think the recommendation for consistent funding across the board we should then start to see the other schools doing their own assessments. I was able to do it through Montgomery County Public Schools as well. And that public schools by the police department, but that doesn't mean that was an option for all the schools either.
Right. Yeah, totally understood. And, bear in mind, I think that these recommendations are meant for the group as a whole. So some of them are going to be things that, this private or non-public schools could do. They are optional. The Safe to Learn Act applies to the 24 public K-12 school systems. So the statutory mandates that are in the Safe to Learn Act are required for them. If the non-public private schools choose to do them, that's fine, but that's not a mandate that's being funded or directed towards the non-public or private schools.
And my point, though, is that if there was funding behind it, couldn't we mandate it then? Because we're talking about the safety for all students.
That would be a legislative issue.
Any other input or comments on this observation and recommendation? Okay. All right, so now we're at a few that we ran through in the last meeting that we're still looking for some recommendations for. We need for more focus on approaches to school safety beyond physical safety and greater consideration of the possible negative effects of physical safety measures, including security, technology, and personnel.
Anybody? Dr. Hoover?
I'm wondering if we could build upon the earlier recommendations around the school safety assessment to be conducted and just ensure that questions are asked about the impacts of physical safety measures on students. So just have that be incorporated into the survey that was recommended earlier.
So the survey recommendation, not the assessment recommendation. Correct.
Maybe I'm not understanding the distinction between the survey recommendation and the assessment.
Sorry, because we were just talking about facility assessments. You're not.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, the survey recommendation.
Yeah, okay. You can do that. Any other comments or input?
And just one more, and then I'll put my hand down, but just, I know that some of the data other systems have looked at is just the disproportionality of discipline by race, ethnicity, gender, and how it correlates with safety measures that are put in place. So that might be something to recommend as well, just looking at that data.
All right, thank you. Any other input or comments? All right, so we're gonna add these questions related to this as part of that earlier survey observation or recommendation, excuse me. Next, a need to address.
Secretary Padilla had her hand up. I wasn't
Oh,
sure.
I'm sorry, Secretary.
Yes, thank you. On the one that we were just discussing, including security technology, I want to pick up on that one. And because I don't come from the school system, this question might be redundant, but has the school completed a cybersecurity assessment recently? And now that the students have notebooks, have we make sure that the security has been tightened, or is that something that we also need to look into?
So is the question, do we survey the school systems and the schools to determine if they've conducted cybersecurity assessments?
Yeah, it's more because I don't know if that has been done or not. If it has been done, it's fine. But if it hasn't been done, is that a recommendation that we need to put out that a cybersecurity assessment and making sure that the notebooks that the students have are secure in terms of safety?
So I know there are, I'm not intimately familiar, but I know the DLS audits include a cyber component. I don't know if some of the new changes to what's happening at Do It and some of the new positions they've added. I don't know if there's going to be an expansion of either cybersecurity assessments or audits or recommendations or anything like that. I don't, Dr. Arlotto, do you know, does the school system typically do a cybersecurity assessment?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question, Secretary Padilla. And thank you, Kate. It's something that was ongoing for the school systems pre-COVID, as we were adding more instructional technology and use of so much more of the materials that we access in the school systems are coming to us electronically from outside the system. And so the protection of our servers, firewalls was something that has been ongoing. And then of course, COVID hits. And to use Anne Arundel County as an example, we go from not being a one-to-one jurisdiction to handing out 85,000 Chromebooks that students are now carrying around at home and in the neighborhoods and to Starbucks and wherever they are accessing the internet. And so it is absolutely the top of the list. I would say for my colleagues, though I can't speak for all of them. So if we are in Anne Arundel County, any indication of what's happening, it is at the top of our list to protect not only the students as they are accessing, but protect the school system as students and others are now accessing from the outside, and how that's done. So it's clearly a top priority for all of us. It certainly has been in Anne Arundel County.
Great, thank you. Karen?
I'm just going to echo Dr. Arlotto, especially after the incident in Baltimore County last year. It's at the top of everyone's list. I don't think we should rely on DLS to do this, because they're currently on a 7-year audit cycle for the school systems. So that's probably not the most appropriate usage of it. Not that you need another survey, but to Secretary Padilla's point, most of the school systems are using some type of tracking software for any of the computers that we hand out in order to monitor for mental health issues, abuse or anything like that. And that's then a coordination between the school system and, the law enforcement departments in that county, or, whoever they're working with. So that could be something that we, lump into this entire recommendation.
Thank you. Chief?
Since we're talking about focusing on an approach that's beyond physical safety, the thing that we're seeing the most of here is the social media aspect of the violence coming into our schools is being driven by the community of, beyond the school itself, and then it just carries itself into the school eventually at some point in time. There's no real way to, technology wise, to hold that accountable. I mean, I know that what you just talked about here is perfectly, valid that we need to do, but maybe there's got to be something along the lines of education, training. We need to approach these kids in a way to address that social media aspect of it. And we got to do that early, and when they're in elementary school leading up through, so they have a better way to handle what they see on social media, whether it's the TikTok challenges to, whatever that is, that's bringing these issues into the school. We've got some kids that'll tell their parents, but then we're trying to figure this stuff out on our own on our side. Schools are trying to do the same thing. And I think there's a missing component there that we need to figure out. I don't have a specific recommendation, but I think there's got to be an approach to the kids in the schools consistently and often that talks about their use and what they see on social media and how they're engaging each other, or what they see others engaging, to bring that safety measure forward to the schools, and then maybe possibly to us and and law enforcement if it goes that far. The negative impacts of the physical safety measures, I get where that's coming from, but that's the hardware component of safety that we're going to deal with, that we can control somewhat. These other aspects are community driven to the school. So I just wanted to bring up something that we need to come up with a solution or some kind of measure to address that side of it.
Mr. Bell?
actually wanted to add to that comment because I thought he brought up a great point. You know, a lot of times we spend our time telling people, you know, we're telling the kids and stuff like that, where you shouldn't do and the negative impacts on the social media and how that can get you, especially when it comes to mental health. Maybe we need to switch things up and turn it to a positive thing. You know, at one point in time, it was optional to take a typing class in high school, and I wish I had taken it, but I didn't. But now, you know, it's kind of one of those things you need to do. Maybe we need to develop programs that show how you can use social media to sell yourself in a more positive light, to gain ground, gain influence, to gain popularity in a positive light. You know, being an entrepreneur, especially nowadays with things like YouTube and all the TikTok, maybe there's ways that we can turn this into a positive program in which the kids can get involved with and say, oh, okay, maybe this is, I can do this. And then it's, you know, deters them from doing all the negative stuff that gets them the views for all the wrong reasons.
And I know, Claire, you have your hand up too. And I don't know if you're going to cover the First Amendment issues, but if you don't, I will.
Yeah, I was going to say something along the lines of that, but I can let you cover that as well. I think what I'm hearing from all of these comments is that, you know, I think personally as a student, the physical safety aspect often occurs after an incident is happening in a school. So I think in terms of this observation, my recommendation would be to focus on preventative measures before we would get to that point where physical confrontation or physical safety was needed. And I think that's a really good point about social media. You know, educating students on the proper ways to use social media, the ways to avoid the bad things in social media. I know you can't always do that, but focusing on that and those preventative measures, I think, would really assist in this issue for sure.
Dr. Hoover?
Yeah, so to the points above, I put a couple of suggested recommendations in the chat box. The first one has more to do with the assessment of outcomes. So just assess the impact of physical safety measures, for example, law enforcement presence, security technology, like metal detectors, cameras, digital monitoring on perceived student and staff safety, student discipline outcomes, and student mental health referrals, including disaggregation by gender, race, and ethnicity. And then to the points that were just raised, really speaking to the need for approaches that go beyond just reactive or physical safety measures. I was suggesting a recommendation, something like increased staff training and student education and supports to promote positive emotional and behavioral coping, to include digital citizenship content. I mean, there's a lot of coursework that's available on, you know, being a positive digital citizen, social media citizen. So just some ideas for recommendations.
Yep. And I was going to add that the preventive measures are people measures, right? Those are things that are directed towards individuals and that help a community, whether it's the school community or the community at large, have a common goal or approach to something. And by doing that kind of outreach on being a positive digital citizen and educating about the First Amendment and what its limits are, both public, out on the street in the community, and with respect to our K-12 population, because it is different and distinct, and there is, long-standing precedent there that the Supreme Court just reiterated again this summer in its ruling. I think overall, my perception is that that is something that is not well understood by people generally. And I know Claire knows it very, very well. I certainly expect that my own kids know it because they're probably tired of me talking about it. But I think that we have to really dig into that. And if our teachers and our administrators and our school-based staff are well educated in it, and our students get well educated in it, that goes out and helps the community, right? So even if you can't reach the parents who don't come to any of the presentations, because there's a population of parents who don't come to any of the things, right? If you've got the students covered and you've got the staff covered, then the expectations that are in the building help translate back out into the community after the bell, because you're talking about a 24/7 issue, not something that is just within the schoolhouse. Claire, you've got your hand back up.
Yeah, I just want to completely agree with that. And I think focusing on the secondary school populations is probably best in terms of talking about the First Amendment and how that relates to social media, because I think you'll get more interest from those secondary school students in that social media and digital citizenship lessons if you're referencing that First Amendment and helping them understand what it means. So I just wanted to completely agree with all of those points.
All right, any other comments or input? Okay. So this observation was there's a need to address and correct inaccurate information which has the potential to inflame tensions. Ideas for recommendations on how to address inaccurate information.
Nobody's raising their hand because this is the dollar question that everybody would love to solve for the universe, I think.
Can we recommend to do away with all social media? Is that within our realm? Can we make that recommendation?
You certainly
want to vote on that?
You have a quorum, Dr. Arlotto, but having been a child of the war on drugs, I'm gonna go that's not gonna work. The absolute ban won't work. So, Claire?
I think this observation specifically, I think the biggest thing that we should focus on is teaching people how to identify when something is not truthful or it is misinformation. And for me, I know I've presented several workshops to other students about how to identify misinformation on social media. There's a lot of great methods out there. If you simply look up how to identify misinformation on social media, and you can just pull it up and figure out a way to present it. So I think if we were able to do something like that, and perhaps create a presentation, and this doesn't just apply to students, this applies for all people in all different areas, just steps to identify misinformation, I think that really helps.
Mr. Bell?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think sometimes, I look at some of our classes, research and development is underrated in school sometimes. And like the scientific method is so important. And it's just not for science, but just for in general, like teaching these kids how to research and find your own opinion and how to, find the sites that may be outside of your comfort zone so you can get the whole story, not the half story. I think it's one of the biggest things that a lot of our kids they don't know where to look to find the information. And if we can help educate them on where to look and what to look for, that could help that situation out a lot.
Chief?
With all the iPads and the devices that we're assigning to these kids in schools, I believe there's got to be a way that from the school standpoint, when it's identified that there's inaccurate information out there that's got a potential for this, that there'd be a way for that to be corrected and spread to all those devices within the school so that the kids would get it because it's going to the devices we assign to them. I know it's not a perfect answer, but at least it gets some information back out there when something's already there and something's brewing. But that would have to be a technology aspect to look into to see how that would be done. But you can't rely on that with just the individual cell phones that the kids have. But for assigning these devices, we should be able to get some information out to address it when it's happening. I agree that getting the education out to the kids on what to do, how to research and identify that is key. But when those things still pop up, it'd be a way for us to address it.
Thank you, Chief. Any other comments? I don't see any hands, I don't think. Okay. Next observation, there are unrealistic expectations regarding what law enforcement and educators can do in response to situations such as community events and/or social media threats or posts.
Claire?
I can go first. I think in terms of how I'm thinking in this question, I think of a presentation the student focus group gets every year or has gotten for the past 2 years. And it's called Understanding the Role of an SRO. And a lot of students don't realize what an SRO can and cannot do and what their role truly is. Sorry for my bird in the background, she's kind of loud. They're unsure of what an SRO can do in schools. And that presentation clears up a lot of questions for students. They're able to have a lot of great discussion afterwards and often tell me and whoever's leading the student focus group, wow, I had no idea that's what an SRO did. So to me, looking at this observation, I think doing something similar to that and clarifying and clearing up what law enforcement and educators can and cannot do in terms of a presentation or just setting those clear guidelines would really help clear up this issue.
Anyone else? Oh, Mr. Bell.
I would even expand that because a lot of information, what they can and cannot do comes from the adults that surround them. But we got to educate the adults of these kids, on what we can and cannot do. Because I hear some unrealistic things all the time coming from parents. We should do this and we should do that. And then of course, I hate when a kid recommends something and they say, well, my mom said we can do this. I'm like, no, that's not quite right. You can't exactly do that. And that's going to be hard because, especially like when we're talking to communicate to the, outside the school, it's always hard getting communication out there, especially when we don't know if that communication is getting to the parents, or if they're going to like grandparents that are raising the kid that don't have access to that technology. But these might be things that we can solve with, outdoor events. When we can start doing those, and maybe we do these educational fairs or something like that, where we can go ahead and talk about these things in forums that are outside from the public and in the community.
Officer Smith, you still have your.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, I think that we're all hitting it on the point. We have to educate adults to educate kids. I know, I was a school-based officer for 16 years, and I know number one thing that I always did was I talked to my freshmen when they came in because they were new to the school. And I think that we have to educate students, and we also have to educate parents, and you also have a good work relationship with administrations of school and your school resource officer, so everybody's on one page to understand what and what can't be done. So that's just hitting it, that's hitting it right there with the nail on the head, is understanding we have to educate, the adults before we can get to the kids. And that will trickle down to the students and let them know, exactly what the resource officer is there for, and understand what the resource officer and how they can help them, and the do's and don'ts of resource officers.
Sheriff Adams?
Thank you. I agree with what everyone said. I think some of this is going to be a case-by-case basis because some of these things get very specific on what we can and can't do and what educators can and can't do. Some of it's broad-based, and I'm sure that all the school-based people and Dr. Arlotto will agree that these student rights and responsibilities handbooks that go home with all the students, that they all read them cover to cover and the parents all read them cover to cover, right? Wait, yeah, right. So a lot of the information is in there and is covered on some of this. It's just not really thoroughly read through. So I think it's going to be, I think there's opportunity to educate better, but some of it is going to be case by case. And the social media threat situations are difficult. Dawn talked a little bit about the First Amendment rights and kind of how some of that comes into play. There's some Second Amendment rights stuff that comes into play. We found out a lot through the COVID situation with online learning and what, invading somebody's house and what you're seeing online. And so it's there's a lot of case by case stuff here, but certainly we can educate as best we can. And if you've worked in the schools at all, we know one of the worst things that can happen is it's not necessarily the incident. Sometimes it's the rumor of incident, and then that's not even true. And then it spreads, and trying to get those things under control. And all that comes back to your relationships with the law enforcement community and the schools. And the better they are, the quicker you can get a handle on those. So I think that's true of just about every one of these things that we're talking about. The relationships between the schools and law enforcement, the better they are, the better we handle all these situations. So I continue to, encourage those to be enhanced. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. Any other comments or input? Secretary Padilla?
Yes, I do agree that all the information is in the student handbooks and the parents sign it, and sometimes you wonder whether they read it or not. But I was wondering if all the schools on the first week of school, if all the schools would issue a message that the student handbook has been revised to cover the can and can't do, and then, put some communication out there to try to entice the parents to really read it and become more educated. If all the schools are doing it at the same time, perhaps we have more chances of getting it read for real. Thank you.
Dr. Arlotto?
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Padilla. That is, I can't speak for all the school systems, but I think I'm fairly familiar with what happens in many, in that at the beginning of each school year, one of the things that occurs is a review of the student and parent handbook and the student code of conduct. We build lessons in our advisory and homeroom periods that the teachers work through over the first couple weeks of school to introduce the students and make sure they have an understanding about some of the key parts about the student code of conduct and the handbook. And then it does go home to parents, and parents are required to read through it and review it with their child. And then they sign off on that they have done that. And we keep that as part of the file that they have read, reviewed, and they sign off on that. And we keep that on file for each of our students. Now, to Sheriff Adams' point, I don't know how carefully that review occurs, but we have had to go back to those signatures on a number of occasions as we're dealing with discipline cases as it revolves around students. But it is fairly typical, and maybe Claire could speak to her engagement in her school district with their student handbook or student code of conduct at the beginning of each school year.
Yeah, to add on to that, in terms of the handbook talk that we get at the beginning of the year, typically what we did this year, and we learned great from virtual, was that our teacher or our principal up on the screen had presented the handbook, and it was broadcasted to the entire school. We were sitting in our homerooms and he had pre-recorded it and we were able to view it. And we would go through the specific sections. We wouldn't read it all the way, but it would just be an overview. I don't know if that's how it is in other counties. I'm from Baltimore County, but that's how we did it. And that's how I know a lot of other schools do it.
And that sounds like a really great idea, having a highlights, because at the beginning of the year, there's a lot of paper, there's a lot of emails, there's a lot of information that gets shoved out. But if you're able to do that sort of highlights overview and have the whole school learn the most significant, or every school is going to have its own common top hits that need to be reviewed, then that will have a pretty big impact.
I know there was also a presentation that was created to go alongside it, and we were able to view that. It was the presentation on one side and then the handbook pages on the other as we were going through. So we had our handbooks in front of us as it was being presented, but only the main points that they wanted us to emphasize were up there. And it was something created by the county. And then our principal had jumped in towards the end and had given his spiel specific to our school. So in general, our county just created this overview, this presentation, they recorded it, and it was sent out to all schools.
Great, thank you. Any additional input on this observation? Okay, we're getting close. So there's a big gap that exists between safe school buildings and safe communities. There's a limited capacity to provide students with a continuum of community-based interventions that support positive behavior. Many students live in communities where they are experiencing or witnessing serious violence. There's also a lack of supportive after-school programs in some areas. So any recommendations to address this observation?
Mr. Bell?
When it talks to after school programs, I'm a big supporter of that. We just got to find ways to keep kids in school, and keep them around school. Sometimes it's very hard to tell an individual you need to stay away from this and stay away from that when as soon as they get off the bus, they have to be swamped with all that coming to them. So whether we do it during the day or doing it after school, and then, of course, we have sports programs, but sports programs, some have certain requirements you have to get special academically. And a lot of times the kids are getting in the most trouble, the kids that don't fit those requirements. So what do we do for them? And then we also have our, ESOL kids, with English and second language kids, we get them, what programs are out there for them to not have to go home that can be involved. So I think we just need to get more creative on what we're doing with the school, with these extra programs, and getting ways or, creating ways that our kids do not have to go straight home after school. And if they do stay after, can we get them a ride home? Because that's a big issue too of, kids staying after school. So they can't get a ride home because of their home life.
Anybody else?
I don't see any, Dawn. Am I missing any?
No.
Okay. All right. Need funding for physical security upgrades, replacement, and additions on buses and in schools, including cameras, fencing, access control system, and vestibules. So right now there is funding through the IAC grant, which we now manage, which will fund some of these both for the public schools as well as private and non-public schools as well. That funding, I believe, is due to expire in 2026. Dawn, I don't know off the top of your head if that's accurate. I think that's correct.
I think that's correct.
So is the request that there is needed funding beyond 2026 for these types of, this type of equipment and materials? Sheriff?
Just on the school bus part of this, I know I spoke to this last meeting a little bit. There are private companies out there that will fund this, totally fund the school bus camera system. And there's other elements that they build into not just the cameras, but also communication devices back to schools and different things. So, I'm not going to advertise a specific one, but there are several of them out there. If you do a little research on those, well, I guess I can say, we are starting one. Actually, this week we will start our social media campaign, advising everyone that this is going to go live starting in January with all our buses. So there's certainly the opportunity out there for those. They're not even grants, they're just directly through these private companies that end up funding themselves. So certainly something you can look into.
So I guess I have one question. This is more a thinking thing, but not it's maybe more rhetorical, but the question doesn't have a time frame in it, or the observation doesn't have a time frame in it. So I guess my question would be, is this in addition to the things that may have already been funded with various grants that and funding streams that came from the Safe to Learn Act? And are there still gaps in your school system? If so, and you're looking for additional budget funding to be able to be issued within grants, either via the Safe Schools Fund or via the IAC grant that Kate mentioned, what has happened or what has been done in order to surface that need so that the budget includes appropriate funding for those grants?
Dawn, my sense is from talking to the superintendents is that there is the need continues, that the school systems took advantage of what has been offered up to this point, but it doesn't cover all the needs. And so the need continues in all of these areas.
And I'm assuming too, because these are for technology-based items, that they have a shelf life and they need to be replenished subsequently, right? So these are not one-time costs. There are ongoing maintenance costs associated with utilizing these technologies. And, you know, has anyone done a budget projection for needs that encompasses, you know, multiple years, so that looking ahead, the state can understand how to adequately fund grant programs to help replenish those technologies once they're implemented?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It is, so some of these are technology driven, some are one-time costs. Those that are technology driven, I would assume that each school system has sort of done their own budgeting. So that'd be something that maybe we could talk about in the future, about taking a look at what the numbers look across the school systems. But for us, as an example, we have cameras in our schools and we've budgeted the out years about when they're gonna have their useful shelf life before they're gonna need to be replaced. The same is true, say, for example, with our Raptor system. A number of the school systems have the Raptor systems. As visitors enter into schools, we know that that's have a shelf life and that you're going to have to pay yearly costs for that subscription. And so you build that into your budgets.
Mr. Bell?
It's maybe more of a question, but I was wondering, I know we're talking about existing technology normally we're picking up, but is any of this funding going towards research and development? I mean, schools are kind of a different animal when it comes into the kids coming through and what they're coming through with, especially with now using the laptops. I think one of the issues we had when we tested out one of our systems was that it kept detecting the laptops alone. So is there anything being done to specifically focus on schools and far as safety security? This might work better for us, where, you know, it might not be adapted for like a warehouse or something like that.
So James, so is your question, are we currently doing any research on what useful security systems and or technology and or facility changes or things like that would be valuable to schools versus other types of facilities? Is that the question?
Yes, basically, are we looking at enhancing the things that exist already so they specifically work for the school systems themselves? I mean, a lot of issues, we're testing things all the time, but are we actually developing equipment that maybe just focuses on how a school interacts on a daily basis to make it more efficient for schools to use and possibly even cheaper?
So my short answer to that is probably not, but that's certainly a conversation we can have with our partners at the IAC, along with individual school systems. I know there's quite a few school systems that are trying out different types of systems to pilot them, to sort of see how they'll work in their school system. You mentioned the one you all just recently went through. There are other school systems doing similar stuff. I'm not sure, Lee, on the the non-public special education facilities, are you all doing any sort of technology research, piloting of anything?
We've been doing it as individual schools and trying to share it across, but it would be beneficial. I mean, we run into the problem, you and I've talked about this, Kate, where pricing for these things is very different when you're representing a school system than when you're representing an individual school. And so being able to get a bigger bang for your buck from across the state would be beneficial to everybody. But like I put in an access control system a couple of years ago, and now we're seeing that it needs to be upgraded so we can do more mobile access control. So it's a constant battle of how you're going to fund it and keep it going. But we do share what technologies amongst the Mansfield schools, we do share what technologies people are using and try to get suggestions across the board that way.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or input on this observation? And Lee, I think the next one rolls into that exactly what you're speaking to. So there's limited school security funding and grants available for smaller school systems and independent schools, which includes the private and non-public special education facilities. So a recommendation would be.
If I can add, let me tap onto that for a second. So for example, the private schools can apply for the Aging Schools Act under the IAC. And it will say that the maximum amount of the grant application is $100,000. And so you plan your security upgrades based on that. But in reality, the maximum outlay has only been $30,000. So, and again, what we pay for some of these upgrades is very different than the school system pays. So being able to come up with a more fluid amount of money somehow would benefit a lot of the smaller schools.
So not just fluid funding, but I also heard you say potential, if there was a mechanism for you to, if there was a blanket purchase order across the state for different types of systems or things like that, that could be useful.
Yeah, you know, having types of multiple types of systems vetted, and then having a statewide pricing mechanism. Not saying that you procure it, the state procures it, but they negotiate the rates and have already vetted systems. Like the school systems have a lot more experience on deciding what are the right systems to use, where smaller schools or smaller school systems may not. And so having that expertise come across the state would make it a lot easier for everybody.
Thank you. Secretary Padilla? I see your
Yes, and I just wanted to share with you that what is being talked is exactly what DO-IT does for the state when it comes to technology. So I'm thinking that the conversation is shifting to, should we have someone of a DO-IT for procurement and school systems? That way we can make sure that is kept up to date, and that we can exercise more reusable of what is being purchased, and that master contract will go a long way in making sure that what is being purchased is what is needed across the state by all the schools, not just one.
I did just want to point out that there may be issues related to procurements where if you're talking about using state resources, either, you know, as a statewide procurement that independent or private schools could potentially participate in, or talking about using state employee staff like at Do It to advise the non-public and private schools, there could be some legal issues there that are problematic.
But I think what we've been suggesting, Dawn, is that somebody vets the types of systems that should be considered, whether it's public, private, or special needs schools. And you come up with an inventory of, not inventory, of a catalog of these are systems that we believe can meet the needs across the state. And then again, you don't procure them, but the discussions with the vendors are to come up with a pricing schedule for any school across the state. And then the private schools and the public schools are not going to procurement of the state. They're just going off of a pricing schedule that's been negotiated. It's like I looked into a couple of different systems before we went with Raptor, for example, and before we went with Crisis Go. And one particular vendor was going to charge me $4.50 a student, but they were going to charge Baltimore County $1 a student. And so we need more money to fund the same types of initiatives. Yes, they have more kids, but comparative to budget wise, it's more of an issue for the smaller private and non-public special education schools. So if there's a way to get statewide funding, but the schools themselves pay for it, is what we're suggesting that we consider.
So that probably is a much larger conversation with Do It and DGS, but certainly something we can take offline and then figure out if there's a way to work it into a recommendation. Okay. Any other input? And I think we're getting very close. And so this came up before. The SRO grant does not allow agencies to hire. Funding cannot be used for other purposes, and the allocation formula in the statute provides only $7,000 per public school. There is really only one recommendation that could come out of that, and that is to change the law, unless, Dawn, you have another brilliant suggestion besides getting the law changed.
I do not, because it is specified, the formula is specified in statute.
Okay. So is that a recommendation this group is willing to make? Chair?
I think this could be another situation where we have another committee meeting with maybe sheriffs and chiefs where similar to what we did for the use of force statewide, and that's another one on the other level of arrest data. I think maybe we sit down and kind of talk about, get everybody in the room to say, this is where we're struggling to make this work, where it needs to be changed and adjusted, and then, yeah, it would have to be taken through legislature.
On that point, time would be of the essence, given the impending regular session start date. So if it is not done in the 2022 session and it doesn't come up till the 2023 session, your earliest start date of any change would likely be July 1st of 2023. So just bear that in mind as you think through this.
Correct.
I think the other thing that would be helpful to understand on this point is what the hiring needs are, because as written, the observation just says the grant program isn't working. But, I'm not saying this is true, but for all I know, maybe there aren't any hiring problems. Maybe we have as many SROs as we need, and this is just a really poorly designed grant program, but it's not causing a problem. I'm guessing that's not the case, but I think it would just be helpful to have a better sense of what those hiring needs or hiring issues are notwithstanding like the weirdness of the grant program.
Anyone else?
I don't see any hands, I think. Okay. And I think this is the last one, which I think we can tie it to that other, when we talk about we were talking about the assessment and looking at some of the reports that we're doing. We also, the request was made to update, and I believe it was the state bullying form. Correct? Yes. So anything else to tie to this one? Because again, we can incorporate that into the assessment of some of the other reports. Anything else to add to this one? Secretary?
The one recommendation is if we could make it consistent across all the different school districts.
Great, thank you.
Just to get some clarification, do you mean updating the standard portions of it that must be included to make sure that those are in fact included across all jurisdictions? Because right now there is standard information that must be included that's in provided by MSDE, but then the schools can add additional things to it. So where would you want to see the standardization occur? Increasing the amount of things that must be included across the board, or compliance with the existing law?
Compliance with the existing law, and that what the school added is kind of in sync. I don't know exactly what other things are the school adds, but if we're gonna collect the data and this is gonna be generating reports, I would say that then the information collected has to be somewhat standardized so the reports can be standard. Otherwise, I don't know how we're gonna come with significant relevance and informative reports.
So I guess you would want to know what is currently collected by MSDE. Is it only those standardized elements that are collected that currently exist? And if there are any other additional elements that some of the school systems may have included that might be useful to the reporting, would we want to make sure they were added across the board to help get the better snapshot of what's happening with respect to bullying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, any other comments or input? Well, Dr. Arlato, it was a long meeting, but it was excellent feedback. So I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Dawn. And thanks to each of you for, as always, your time and energies, good conversation and great suggestions as we want to work with the advisory, with the, that's terrible. As we work to advise others in this area of school safety. So I thank you for all of this work today. We are scheduled to meet again February 7th. And we are scheduled to meet in person. And we can determine that as we get closer to that date, if that's where everybody wants to be. But we're glad you are all glad to be here at Anne Arundel County and meet together if that is the desire of the group. Is there anything for the good of the order that anybody wants to share? And I'm going to look for hands. Not seeing any. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Yes, I make a motion to adjourn. This is Detective Smith.
Thank you, Detective Smith, with a motion to adjourn. A second?
This is Secretary Padilla. I second, and at the same time, I wish you all happy holidays. Great year.
Thank you, Secretary Padilla. And any discussion? All those in favor of adjournment?
Aye.
Aye.
Hands are aye. Thank you. Any dissent?
That'll be the day.
Exactly. Not hearing any. Again, thank you all very much for your time and energies, great input. And I second Secretary Padilla's wishing everyone happy and safe holidays. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you in
Thank you.
February. Thank you.